In this lecture, we are going to investigate the last main decision related to problem setting. As a recap, problem setting is the first phase of decision-making process and aims at understanding which are the main elements of the problem. Three are the main concepts to take into account, which are goals, constraints, and development of the models. Let's see the development of models. A model is a selective representation of the reality. The key word of this definition is selective representation. In fact, it is not possible neither useful to represent all the elements and the variables existing in reality into a model. In reality, there are several factors that are relevant per se, but that are not directly impacting on the specific decision. The consideration of all the variables could simply create confusion in the eyes of the decision maker, thereby making the choice much more challenging. Due to this definition, it is easy to understand that different models with different purpose might be developed for the same reality. It is part of problem setting to set up the right model for the specific situation, including all the actors, variables and aspects that are potentially impacting the choice, and excluding all the others that are outside the boundary of the specific decision-making process. Moreover, a model is depending on goals and constraints identified in the decision-making process. A world map, a physical world map, and a political world map are three different representations of the same reality, the world. It is thereby quite clear that each of them is pursuing a different goal and is considering different constraints. This is done because also the purpose for the decision-making process is different. It is not a good idea to look for a mountain through a political map or to look for a city through a topographical map. The same is true at the company level. To evaluate the production schedule into a company, production manager is considering as variable the production capacity, the expected demand, the number of days the plant is open. On the contrary, production manager is seldom interested in some financial data such as the interest rate or the level of company debt. On the contrary, the same production manager interested in buying a new machinery is interested again in the expected demand, but it is also interested in the interest rate that will be applied to the loan for the plant. Same people in the same environment are developing different models for different kinds of decisions. There is a standard notation that can be used to represent models to take a decision. The notation aims, first of all, at classifying the main variables. In fact, each decision could be summarized through three main types of variables. The first type of variable pertains to decisional variables, D. Decisional variables pertain to all the variables that are totally under the control of the decision maker, because it represents the main decisions or the main levers that the manager could have. Examples of decisions could be the entrance into a new market, the setup of a new plant, the launch of a new product. The second type of variable pertains to the endogenous variables related to the objectives or that the manager is willing to achieve. Endogenous variables pertain to all the variables that are the final purpose of the decision. In this case, it is important to consider the goal of all the involved stakeholders. As far as possible, it will be preferable to try to map also implicit goals rather than explicit ones. Examples of objectives could be increase the profit, increase the market share, or reduce the cost. Sometimes decisions do not impact directly on the final objectives, but some intermediate results are achieved, which are functional or enabling to reach the final goal. For example, to increase the turnover, it is necessary to increase the number of customers. This type of endogenous variable is called instrumental objectives. The third type of variable pertains to the environmental variables, E. This pertains to the external elements that are not under the control of the company, that actually cannot be directly impacted by the company too, but that are highly impacting on the achievement of final objectives. For example, the economic situation, the choices of the competitors, or the country regulation are environmental variables. A typical representation of a model is the combination of these variables and illustrates that the achievement of endogenous variables is depending on decisions, external environment, and of course instrumental objectives, as represented in the formula. The typical tool adopted to represent a model is the causal map. The goal of a causal map is to report a representation of the reality that is showing existing relationship among all the variables. A causal map is a combination of nodes and arrows. The former represents variables, whereas the latter represents the relationship. Arrows are described by a sign. Positive if the two variables are positively correlated, whereas negative if they are negatively correlated. To develop a causal map, there are some rules to bear in mind. First rule is that decisions cannot be impacted by other variables because are independent variables. Secondly, for the same reason, environmental variables cannot be impacted by other variables because are perceived as external, and so the decision maker cannot change their value. On the contrary, objectives are impacted by any kind of other variables, but are not impacting of anything else. Being the last goal to achieve, it is the last point of the decision-making process. Finally, instrumental objectives are impacting on higher level objectives, but are impacted by other variables as well, namely environmental and decisional variables.